We're going to look at evolution now. Evolution is the process by which organisms or living things change over time. And we're going to look at the individual and their evidence that supported this idea. Now, in the past, before the discoveries about evolution made by the scientist Charles Darwin, the prevailing or the common ideas among scientists was that many organisms did not change over time. For example, like a Taiwan bluebird. After thousands of years, the family of Taiwan bluebirds, they all stay the same. Okay, so that prevailing idea was that organisms do not change over time. However, around the 1800s, there were discoveries of fossils, these ancient bones, and they showed that some organisms in the past were very different from ones that live today. But so people and scientists naturally wondered, well, why are there bones of organisms that don't exist today? Another piece of evidence that challenged the idea that organisms do not change over time is that some of these fossils had similarities to organisms that are around today, but there were some things that were different about them compared to organisms around today. Now, another key idea we're going to look at is the changes in the environment and how that influences organisms. So changes in the environment. So for the environment, the place where an organism lives, well, we can think about what kind of changes. Well, for example, we could talk about how the climate changes over a long time. So the weather patterns. We can talk about how changes in the environment. Well, for example, if there's a volcano and the volcano changes it has lava that ends up burning away all the plants, and now some land is now just rocks. That's a change in environment. Well, what do organisms do about that? So we're now looking at Charles Darwin, and he was a scientist. We could call him an evolutionist, which means he studied the process by which organisms change over time. And he wrote a book that presents his theory and the evidence to support his theory of evolution. The book is called On the Origin of Species. In this book, Charles Darwin's idea is that natural selection is the process by which organisms change over time. Natural selection means how does nature pick which organisms will survive? Now, how did he develop these ideas? Well, in the 1830s, Charles Darwin traveled through many parts of the world. For example, he went to Australia. He ended up going across several continents, and perhaps his greatest discoveries were made on this group of islands, this archipelago, just west of South America. This group of islands, the Galapagos, had many features that helped him create and support his ideas about the process of evolution by natural selection. Now, when Charles Darwin visited places such as Australia, he saw there were organisms that, first of all, there were organisms that only lived in that part of the world and nowhere else. So, for example, in Australia, there are organisms such as kangaroos that only live on that part of the world. When Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, one organism that lives there is an iguana, but it's the only reptile in the world that seeks out its food in the water, more specifically in the ocean. Now, so Charles Darwin wondered why are there certain species or organisms that only live in one place and nowhere else, and why do they have these very unique or special characteristics? So, as we said, he observed a wide variety of organisms, and he observed and he took note that all these different kinds of organisms had characteristics that allowed them to adapt or to have suitable ways to survive in the environment where they lived. And to further support his theories, he collected many specimens and many fossils. So specimens such as he would find examples of butterflies, and he studied like the different colors, the different sizes, all these different features that these organisms had, and he would compare it and contrast, find what was similar and different between those butterflies and others. Okay, now, so in the mid 1830s, in 1835, Charles Darwin arrived on the Galapagos Islands. Now, the Galapagos Islands are special for many reasons, but for a few things Charles Darwin noticed was that each island, because of the different kinds of climates there, so each island had different kinds of rainfall patterns. So one side of the island might be very dry, another part might be very wet. And each island had different kinds of terrain, like different hills, mountains. These are volcanic islands. So there are some islands that had a very, very fresh lava rock. as the rock. So some places that were essentially without any plants and animals, or so he thought. And there were other places that had forests. So, while Charles Darwin was on the Galapagos, he studied a kind of bird called finches. Now, finches live in many parts of the world, but he noticed that the finches that lived on the Galapagos shared some similarities. They looked and behaved similarly to ones on the mainland of South America. And yet, he noticed that each island had varieties of finches that had different kinds of beak characteristics. So their beaks had different sizes, different shapes, and they corresponded with, they were related, those beak shapes and sizes were related to the kinds of foods that those finches relied on each island. Now, here's an example. A broad beak, this like very wide, very kind of large beak, it was made or adapted for eating very large seeds. Next, we have this kind of finch. It has a very sharp beak, and this is for eating very small seeds. And as you can see in this picture, this finch is eating some of the small seeds that are found in a cactus. And now we have another variety of finch. This finch has a beak that's useful for gripping or grabbing onto small organisms like insects. So the other finches eat different kinds of nuts or seeds. This kind of finch eats animals. It eats insects. And then we have this vegetarian tree finch. Vegetarian tree finch has its own specially shaped and sized beak that is suitable or helpful for tearing leaves. Now, Darwin made a few conclusions. First, his first conclusion was that finches have different kinds of beaks on these different islands. Now, each island has its own special food resources. If a finch has the right kind of beak for eating the right kind of resource on one of those environments, that finch would survive, it would live on, it could reproduce, so it would have and then pass on its characteristics, its physical and other adaptations of their beaks to their offspring, their babies. Now, on the other hand, a finch that had a beak that was less well adapted or not useful for eating the resources on the island where it lived, it couldn't find enough food. As a result, it couldn't grow, probably would not reproduce, and as a result, it would not pass on the characteristics, those unhelpful characteristics. Another conclusion that Darwin made is that over a very long period of time, perhaps hundreds of years, at some point there were finches that probably moved from the mainland of South America to the Galapagos Islands. And by this process of what we call natural selection, so natural selection in this example is that each of these finches has a beak that helps it find food, survive, and reproduce, have offspring, and pass on these helpful characteristics. Well, over time, these finches from the distant past, when they moved to the Galapagos Islands, they lived on different islands and they changed or evolved into different species of finches. Now, they changed to have different food resources on the different kinds of islands where they lived. So, in 1858, both Charles Darwin and another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, put forward their ideas, the theory of natural selection. So, next time you are observing nature, think about the plants, the animals, the fungus, all these organisms around you. Think about, have they always been like this, or are there things in the environment that influence them, that somehow have made them different from their ancestors from the past?